From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. Today we're going to be taking stock of 2020, covering the key developments and trends we've seen so far this year and discussing what might be in store in the months to come. Today's program will be broken up into two different segments. In the first, we'll be with Paul Salem, MEI's president, and the second with Rhonda Sleeman, senior fellow and director of MEI's Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues program. Paul, thank you for joining us today, and welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Alistair, and welcome to all listeners.
We're only just past the halfway mark, but 2020 has proven to be quite a dramatic year, both for the Middle East and indeed the world. And there's certainly plenty to discuss, from the coronavirus pandemic and the resulting economic fallout to US-Iran tensions and the region's ongoing civil wars. In your view, what have been the most important developments and trends so far this year in the Middle East?
Well, by far the most important development, which has three massive aspects to it, is the multiple impacts of the COVID crisis. Obviously, like the rest of the world, this is the biggest pandemic to hit the region since aftermath of World War I. We are also likely in the early stages of this pandemic. As we're seeing in the US and other places, the second and third waves might be on their way. I'm still extremely concerned about countries with large populations if this gets out of hand there, as it has in other countries like Brazil or the United States. And I obviously continue to be very concerned about the large refugee and IDP populations. Also, it's beginning to hit there as well. So health-wise, this could end up leading to the deaths of more people than died in all of the wars in the Middle East in the last decade. So this is still a major, major risk to human life. Secondly, the economic impacts are again in the early stages. This is the biggest economic contraction that the Middle East has seen in modern memory. It is a contraction that varies maybe from 3-4 points to possibly much larger. Again, you have to take into account that we don't know if this economic paralysis is going to continue for the rest of 2020, maybe half of 2021 or more. So this is incalculable in terms of its effects on rise in poverty, rise in unemployment, and then what effects that might have on stability. The third dynamic, which is partly but not totally related, has been the collapse of oil prices, the biggest collapse, again, in a very long time in the Middle East. This partly relates to the contractions of the COVID crisis and decline in demand, but also had to do with the fracking revolution and energy being more available from other sources, and the world is slightly transitioning to alternative energy. So maybe that was a crisis in the making. And the effects of the collapse of oil prices obviously have a big effect on oil exporting countries. There, the Gulf countries are very dramatically affected. Also Algeria in a big way. But also non-oil exporting countries rely either from remittances of nationals who work in oil-rich countries, or they also benefit from investments that come from the Gulf in particular to other regional economies, or they benefit from direct assistance. All of those economic lifelines have been dramatically hit. So this is a very, very major systemic shock to the economies and hence the social numbers, unemployment, poverty, hunger, famine, potentially in some countries, which then in turn affects stability and risks of instability. So this is huge and it's ongoing. To get a bit more issue specific, and as you said, to look at the ongoing civil wars, for example, I would say one of the biggest confrontations in the region has been between the US and Iran. The year started with the U.S. assassinating Qasem Soleimani, which was a big potential escalation point, but in fact, it led to de-escalation for a number of months where both sides were kind of wary of each other. But just the last week, we've had what appear to be either cyber attacks or covert attacks on Natanz and other major sort of places inside Tehran. So we're in a new moment in July where it's uncertain whether there will be another round of escalation between Iran and the US. We've seen things get a bit more tense in Iraq. Whether there will be Iranian counterattacks through cyber methods inside the US, all things that, are concerning. So that, US Iran, US Israel Iran tension is still very high. On the other hand, US Gulf relations, I think, have de escalated from the high tensions that we had, particularly in 2019, with the high point of the attack on the Uptake Aramco facility in Saudi Arabia. Really, now you would say Iran and the Gulf countries, mainly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, those relations were much more confrontational. They've de escalated quite a bit. And I think that's led to a little bit of de escalation in Yemen and certainly less direct threat, it seems, of any Iranian attacks on Saudi or the UAE or anything like that. And that's, I think, a good thing. On the Israel Palestine and Israel Arab situation, obviously the big event was the so called US Trump deal of the century, which really was the giveaway of the century. And we are now at risk of the Israeli government annexing unilaterally parts of the West Bank. That may or may not happen, but I think the US administration completely shifting its position from one of some kind of mediator between the two to one of really supporting Prime Minister Netanyahu. And apparently, whatever he ends up wanting to do is very dangerous and very concerning. When we look at the civil wars themselves, Yemen, yes, maybe things have de escalated a bit in terms of the proxy, Iran, Saudi Arabia aspect of it. But Yemen continues to be deeply mired in a very complex domestic situation. There have been attempts to de escalate and so on, but no major breakthroughs there. But I think it still very much bears efforts at diplomacy and conflict de escalation. In Libya, things got worse, not better. They initially got worse with General Haftar trying to take Tripoli. And then, they got, in a sense, worse again with Turkey trying to take Tripoli with support from the UAE, Egypt, and Russia, you would say, and then his forces being beaten back by a significant Turkish presence in Libya on the side of sort of the Tripoli forces with effective drones and with some mercenaries or fighters that they brought over from Syria. So Libya maybe was closer to some kind of negotiated solution a year ago. It's certainly farther than that now. In Iraq, which is not exactly a civil war, we've seen attempts, the formation of the new government and sort of muddling through, but at a time when oil prices and the collapse of oil prices have really hit the Iraqi budget and Iraqi capacity to care for its population at a time of shrinking economy and massive COVID crisis, let alone, lingering confrontations with ISIS and political problems and corruption. One country, obviously, that has become very, very much a country of great concern is Lebanon. And we've done a lot of stuff on Lebanon and MEI just yesterday and weeks before. Lebanon's economy has collapsed, its currency has collapsed, its banks, private banks, and the government are effectively bankrupt. The country, previously a middle income country, is slipping into lower middle income or, God forbid, really lower income. Unemployment passing 50%, unemployment passing 40%, and the real threat of hunger, or dare I say it, famine. So I'll stop there with a lot of the goings on.
Moving on to the international level, you touched on a few of the key issues already, like Iran and the threat of Israeli annexation. But how would you assess U.S. policy towards the Middle East this year?
There are three headlines. I mean, a couple of we've talked about a little bit. I mean, obviously, the U.S. has the maximum pressure campaign on Iran. That has continued. There was the killing of Soleimani, which was Trump's threat and red line, and I think it got the Iranians' attention, and they haven't done anything dramatic since then. But as I said, there's new tension brewing. The maximum pressure campaign has not borne tangible fruit. It has not changed Iran's behavior in the region at all. It has not brought Iran to the negotiating table. If anything, it's pushed it farther away. And while it's brought a lot of economic and social pain and cost to the regime and to the government and to the people of Iran, the political impact of that has been a bit of a rallying around the flag in Iran, because now the government can blame hardships on America rather than its own ineptitude. So it's kind of been a counter effect politically. With Israel, I've mentioned the dramatic shift, and I think that's egregious. It's going to be difficult for any future administration to walk back. I think vis-a-vis the Gulf, I think it's very significant and maybe underplayed that since the Carter years and the Carter Doctrine, the understanding among America's Gulf partners is that if they were directly attacked by Iran, for example, the U.S. would swing into action, that would be a red line. That's maybe understood a little bit by the Carter Doctrine, also the reaction when Saddam invaded Kuwait, the U.S. immediately moved. But I think the Gulf countries have realized that the Trump administration has moved away from that policy. That if Iran attacks the Gulf countries, the U.S. does not spring into action. It may, be willing to help, to sell arms, to coordinate, but the red line is not attacks on Gulf partners. The red line is attacks on American personnel, and that was made very clear. So that's a new reality for the Gulf countries vis-a-vis the U.S. Still the main partner, still the main strategic defender, but that there isn't a direct American security umbrella over them. That's very significant. So I would say, those are some of the headlines. Obviously, foreign policy has not been front and center for this administration. After the COVID crisis hit, it's all largely domestic.
What about other outside actors like Europe, Russia, and China? What have we seen on that front in 2020?
Not dramatic change. China is sort of the emerging giant, but it's continued to tread very, I would say, gingerly and carefully in the Middle East. Its presence is largely through infrastructure, investment, and trade. Two main things that I think have been issues of, drawn a lot of attention. One is the issue of the 5G networks, and particularly if they are to be purchased in the Gulf countries, that's been a serious problem on the US side that has been warning that if countries opt for 5G and Huawei and the Chinese 5G, then the US military will no longer be able to coordinate with their militaries, since all militaries do rely on communications, cell and satellite communications. So there's a very serious issue between the US and China in the Middle East over 5G. Another issue that has come up recently, but I think is a bit overblown, there was much fanfare a few days ago about the announcement of a Chinese Iranian strategic agreement for the next, decades and so on, with a lot of fanfare and a sense that, perhaps China is making one of its first big geostrategic moves in the region by aligning with Iran. But really, when you look at the fine print, you talk to people in Iran and China and so on, that's really not the case. I mean, Iranian Chinese relations have been strong, have been fairly close. It's no secret that China has a lot of interest in Central Asia. Iran is a big player. Iran has a lot of energy. China desperately needs energy. They've had pretty close relations for a very long time. They also consider themselves, both ancient civilizations with long histories. I think Iran kind of blew the trumpet on this deal with China, which is really a continuation of largely previous deals that happened before. I think Iran was using it to threaten or thumb its nose at the Americans and the Europeans, saying, if you don't play nice with us, we'll go with the Chinese. But Iranian suspicions and fears of China are very, very deep. China is very close to Iran. So I think it's overblown. On the Chinese side also, at a moment when, the Trump administration and the Chinese administration are really loggerheads, previously over the trade, disagreements, and now over COVID, which the US and China are going at it, trying to blame each other. I think also China blew the trumpet a bit to irritate the Americans on the score, but I really think it's overblown. On the Russian side, and we've just had some very interesting meetings with some Russian colleagues, I would say nothing dramatically new. Obviously, their presence in Syria continues. It continues to be a mess. They continue not to be able to really find an end game there, but it is a win for them. They are major players there. They're not moving dramatically in other parts of the Middle East. And really, when you look at Russia in the first 6 months of this year, President Putin is in a very difficult situation internally. His opinion polls are way down from what they were, alarmingly. The COVID crisis is unfolding in very negative ways for him, a little bit like unfolding negatively for President Trump. His government, his federal government, wasn't really able to get ahead of the crisis, ended up relying on local governments and so on. So he's in very, very deep domestic concern in addition to the economic impacts of it. So I would say the Middle East has really not been front and center for President Putin. He continues to value his relationship with Iran, partly because, again, they are neighbors that play a big role in Central Asia. I mean, Russia's near abroad, and they are partners in Syria, and they are useful to irritate and challenge the U.S. But I think otherwise, Russian actions and ambitions are quite limited. Europe, I mean, I would say there's not really headlines to say there, other than to say that Europe is really completely on a different page from the U.S. when it comes to the Israel-Palestine issue. Europe is on a different page than the Trump administration when it comes to the Iran issue. But Europe is internally divided with Brexit, and now with the massive effects of COVID, which are closing down even internal borders in Europe. So everybody's sort of more busy internally, and Europe really hasn't had any major initiatives, even on Libya, which is their backyard. They've played a very marginal role compared to much more distant countries like the UAE or Qatar or Turkey or Egypt or Russia for that matter. So kind of absent, missing in action.
Looking ahead to the rest of 2020, what are the key issues on your radar? What will you be paying particular attention to in the months to come?
A number of major things. I mean, one is phase 2 and 3, or whatever you want to call it, of this pandemic and its effects. It looks like it is not being, resolved or handled, certainly not in the near time frame. So I think the rest of 2020 will be greatly impacted by the elaboration, evolution of this pandemic, both on its health and economic and social consequences. I said that greatly concerns me in some of the countries in the Middle East, which have large populations and limited government capacity and strained economies and strained budgets already. The second, obviously, the big event of the year for the whole world are the US elections of November. Everybody's going to be looking to them. The Iranians are waiting to see who they're going to have to deal with in the White House in January. Prime Minister Netanyahu has to worry about, should he annex? Now is his chance, because if, Biden comes into office, he won't have the same level of positivity. So it greatly impacts Israeli decision making. So I think, many eyes will be on that. In the near term, as I said, I'm very concerned about Lebanon. I think that's the country next on the brink in the Middle East. Of course, we're concerned about many countries, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Jordan. Many of them have problems, but Lebanon is in free fall. It's in a different situation. And the urgency there is to do everything possible, first of all, to ease the pain and to help and assist the poor and the impoverished and the hungry in Lebanon, but also to do everything possible to make sure Lebanon does not become completely a collapsed state or a failed state, which happened in 1975, which would put Lebanon maybe for the next decade or more into a very, very serious state collapse, militias all over the place, return of and resurgence of extremist groups, terrorist groups, and so on, and migration, both by the Syrian migrants or refugees that are in Lebanon who might have to leave Lebanon and go to Cyprus or go to Europe. And I know, sadly, there might be Lebanese refugees as well. So that certainly worries me in a big way. I looked at 2021 potentially as, could be a year of hope. The pandemic could begin to be behind us. Economies might begin to recover. And it's possible that, with a Biden administration, new diplomatic efforts could be set in motion.
We'll have to leave things there for now. But thank you very much for joining the podcast today, Paul.
Thank you, Alistair. Thank you all for listening.
In the second part of today's program, we're joined by MEI's Rhonda Sleeman. Rhonda, welcome back to the podcast.
Good to be back, Alistair. Thank you for having me on.
In the first part of today's episode, we talk with Paul about some of the key developments and trends across the region that we've seen so far this year. And in this segment, I wanted to focus on the rest of 2020. The single biggest issue this year, both in the Middle East and around the world, has, of course, been the coronavirus pandemic. Beyond the immediate public health response and the economic downturn, what are the longer-term consequences for the region that seem especially salient to you?
You know what? I think we need to think of at least 3 longer-term consequences for the rest of 2020, but also beyond that. I think the first one is that the social contract that has existed in the region is unfolding, has been unfolding now since 2010 when the Arab Spring started. But the first wave of the Arab Spring has spared some countries, especially monarchies, that have been able to buy citizens' loyalty with money. Now, with the economic downturn in many of these countries, but also this downturn in oil producing countries has also affected non-oil producing countries like Egypt, which has been able to use repression and coercive force to, in a way, delay that reckoning of renegotiating a social contract. What's going to happen is that the COVID and the economic downturn has, in a way, accelerated that process. GCC countries, especially the three wealthiest among them, can maybe delay that reckoning for some time, but it's not going to be for the long term. So at some point, the ongoing process of renegotiating social contract between government and citizens that have been taking place, as I said, since 2010 in Tunisia, in Syria, now in Libya, in Yemen, taking place through violent means in places like Syria and Yemen, and even Iraq until recently. I think it's going to regain that momentum to renegotiate social contract, which has been quieted down by COVID-19, pushing people outside the street. It's going to pick up again, and we're going to start seeing more of these protests, more of these demands for representation, for good governance starting to appear in countries where this has not been the case in 2010. So that's one impact. The second impact is the inequities. I think this is a region where you have had long enduring inequities. And what COVID has done is it has deepened them. And I think what COVID will be doing in the long term, along with the economic downturn, is also deny governments the ability to address, at least ability economically, to address these inequities. And it's going to be felt even more so in countries that have suffered from conflicts. Countries like Syria, Yemen, Libya, Iraq. We are starting to see it in Lebanon, where you have had civil war, but also you have had bad, governance for decades since the end of its civil war. And so what you are going to see is that the poor segments getting poorer because there will be less jobs available. The sick people they will become more sick, if we can put it this way, because government will have less funds to dedicate to improving health sectors. You are going to have larger portions of kids not getting schoolings. We're already seeing this problem with refugees, and internally displaced people in Syria, Iraq, Libya, Yemen. So that's going to be also a growing problem going forward. So the third impact is more on the strategic level. There are two kinds of competitions going on. On one hand, you have the extra-regional competition, US, China, Russia. A lot has been said about Russia becoming more opportunistic in expanding its foothold in the region, although it has much more limited capacities than people, I think, give credit to. China is playing more the economic card. We have yet to see if it's going to start engaging in the political and security fields. The US seems to be, two of the pillars of US engagement in the Middle East has been, one is the guarantee of the free flow of energy through the Persian Gulf, the Carter Doctrine. And then two, since the 9/11, it's the fight against extremism and terrorism and preventing that from representing a threat to the homeland. And I think in both cases, what the pandemic has done is on one hand, it has made reliance on oil less relevant. More and more of the developing economies are moving away from fossil fuels, and that's going to accelerate with time. And the second is that the pandemic has shown that it's more of a threat to the homeland, at least for the United States, than, for example, the terrorist threat. COVID has killed more Americans than Al-Qaeda or ISIS has done, or any other extremist group. That's going to make it more politically palatable for the United States to argue for disengagement from the region on the basis of just fighting terrorism group and preventing them from representing a threat to the mainland. Now, there are opportunities. Again, every crisis presents opportunities. There is opportunities for especially the oil-rich countries that have reserves they can use to weather the economic crisis in the short to medium term. But there is an opportunity for these countries to wean their economies off the reliance on oil as a major source of revenue and moving from a rentier to more productive economies. So if they can engage in the necessary economic reforms, I think that could be in the long term beneficial for these countries. Also, there is an opportunities for countries like Lebanon, countries like Egypt, countries like Jordan. After all, a good percentage of their population is or used to be employed in the oil-rich countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE. As with the economic downturn, many of these expatriates are going home. They are highly skilled. New graduates are not finding jobs to go to Dubai, to go to Saudi Arabia, or to go to Kuwait because there are no jobs to be had. And so you have more of this human skills, entrepreneurial spirit staying at home. Maybe that can provide the grounds for new kind of knowledge-based economies to develop in many of these countries.
Next, I wanted to turn to the US presidential election this fall. If it looks like Joe Biden may win, as recent polling suggests, how might that influence the calculus for regional actors in the run-up to November?
Right now, all the regional actors are in a holding pattern. There is one caveat, is that we are seeing this escalation on the Iranian-Israeli front with these mysterious explosions that are taking place in different parts of Iran, targeting weapons installations, nuclear installation, as well as industrial plants. So it's going to be interesting how Iran will react or will Iran, engage in strategic patience and hold off on any kind of reaction because they think or they calculate that a Biden administration will be more favorably disposed toward relations with Iran in the future. So taking this caveat, I think the region now is going to enter into a holding pattern until November, awaiting the outcome of the presidential elections. So far, what we can say about a Biden administration's policy in the Middle East, based on what's potentially senior officials in this administration are now saying in different talks, on different calls with different constituencies and communities in the United States, that one, the Biden administration want to elevate diplomacy. So this president-centered kind of politics like Trump has engaged in, especially in dealing with authoritarian leaders around the world, including also in the Middle East, the Biden administration will move away from that. And it's going to elevate again the work of seasoned diplomats and the role of the State Departments and civilian officials in diplomacy. That's one. Second pillar of foreign policy for a Biden administration, again, according to individuals today who are consultant to the campaign and are likely to be senior officials in a Biden administration, is the elevation of emphasis on values and particularly democratic values. One senior official in the Biden campaign in a recent conversation mentioned 2 countries that are going where business as usual as conducted by the Trump administration will shift totally under a Trump administration. And those 2 countries he mentioned were Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And then third, there is more of an emphasis by a Biden administration on development and development assistance. Vice President Biden has already pledged to increasing the cap that is right now placed on refugees from 18,000 to 120,000 in the future. You are going to see also a different tone in how a Biden administration will deal with the Islamic world. They are going most likely to lift the ban on the travel from Islamic countries. And I think the most area of foreign policy that the Biden administration will focus on quickly is going to be Iran. However, assuming that we have a Biden president come January 2021, and then you have a very short window for some kind of a policy change, because then you have the Iranian election in 2021, June or May. And so within this short window, according to Vice President Biden, he would like to rejoin the JCPOA, assuming that Iran has recommitted to to its commitments to the JCPOA. So we might see some trend toward de-escalation in the tension between the United States and Iran. And that will affect the whole region. It will de-escalate tension throughout the region, because that's one of the line of conflicts, that is fueling a lot of the proxy conflicts in the region. That's on the extra-regional aspect. However, on the regional aspect, you have had, ongoing competition now for some time between the four regional powers: Israel, Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. This competition is manifesting itself in different ways, in different conflicts, in different countries. In Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq. And I don't see how this regional competition will diminish. More importantly, I think whether it's a second Trump administration or whether it is a Biden administration, I think the abilities of extra-regional actors, be it the United States, Russia, or China, to influence or to control the tempo of regional competition has been decreasing for some time. I mean, look at for example, the intra-GCC crisis. Despite all the efforts spent by the Trump administration for the last some years, they have not been able to get the situation resolved, because this is an intra-GCC, this is an intra-regional conflict. And so we are going to see more and more as the United States disengages from the region, and as Russia faces limitation in its ability to project its power in the region, as China maybe sticks to the economic and shies away from the political and the security fields, we are going to see more and more these regional drivers of conflict gain more importance, along with the decreased ability of extra-regional mediators, be it the United States or Europe, to really influence or control the tempo of this competition.
We'll have to leave things there for today, but thank you very much for joining the podcast, Randa.
Thank you, Alistair, for having me on.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in, and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.